So it's sufficient assumption once again, but do we see indications that it's worth diagramming this one? Do we see multiple conditionals that might be linked in some way? Like I look at the conclusion here, I don't think of that as being a straightforward conditional. Like you could say if something's love, then it's not feelings. I suppose you could do that, but I think it gets really messy here. I think honestly with this one, I wouldn't diagram it. I see a general principle in the evidence, or at least a general principle that we can extract out of the evidence here. If love refers to feelings, the promise makes no sense for all these various reasons. Therefore, thus, no one should take love to be referring to feelings. Meaning that if interpreting love or defining love a particular way makes no sense, therefore, don't do it that way. So it's kind of like we have in our argument, in the stimulus, we have evidence and conclusion in the stimulus. Then our job for the sufficient assumption is simply to say, if evidence, then conclusion. That's all you have to do. A generalized version of the argument itself will guarantee the case in the stimulus. And I'm, of course, defining the conclusion loosely here and saying that it's because referring to love in this way makes no sense, therefore don't do it. And D just generalizes from beyond just love in particular to promises overall. And if we do that, of course it'll fit the particular situation about love.
Hard question.
It's a very hard question, yeah. D. So promises should not be interpreted in a way that makes no sense, because if you take that as a whole, even though it's stronger than the stimulus, that's fine. That applies to the situation in the stimulus about love in particular.
Would the answer ever be stated? So A, none of our feelings are within our control because it's stated in the promise.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so A is, of course, technically true. It's something that you can infer based on the stimulus, but the question is, does it get the job done? And so A, which is referring to what is really just a piece of evidence here, for feelings are not within one's control, that won't have the desired impact to guarantee the argument. Now,
well, it's already stated. Feelings are not within one's control.
Well, it's okay for a sufficient assumption to be already stated. The question is, does it close the gap? So like here, I'm saying the stimulus is a combination, of course, of evidence and conclusion. And I'm seeing that D is like a broader version of that, going from the case of love in particular to promises overall. And saying that since love, interpreting love as feelings makes no sense, don't do it that way, we can then, in D, take a general principle out of that and say, don't interpret any promise in a way that would make no sense. So D is, of course, more extreme and generalized than what the case in the stimulus about love, but that's fine. The question is, does it achieve that objective? Something like A is the right answer to the wrong question because it simply is an inference, it's a piece of evidence, it will not have the desired impact to destroy the conclusion. Now, I could see there being cases where the sufficient assumption is a restatement of the argument. I see that all the time. It happens quite a bit. It'll typically be a little bit more generalized than the argument, but it'll fit it pretty closely. More closely than D does, which of course is much broader.
Is there another, this reminds me of another question style, I guess, but it says the conclusion follows logically if it adheres to this principle or leads to this principle. Do you know what the question style is called?
If it adheres to this principle.
Yeah.
I'd have to see an example.
I didn't think to do that because the question stimulus doesn't resemble what makes me think to take something broader from this. I assumed you had to insert something to make it work, whereas you're saying you can extract a kind of broader concept, and adhering to that broader concept allows this logic to flow.
Yeah.
And there's another question style that more explicitly states that.
You do have a type that's principle application. And so the application would be general.
So maybe that's what I'm thinking.
And the application is specific. So you do have questions like that where the principle is like the method of reasoning you would extract from a parallel reasoning question over like the general rule that could be applied to both the stimulus and a particular situation in the choices. And the application is that particular situation. Now you're asking about sufficient assumption. I think that sufficient assumption, the principle, it functions like the principle, essentially. Like this correct answer choice D here, that could be applied not only to the situation with love referring to feelings, but to many other things as well. Any promise that doesn't make sense shouldn't be interpreted in a particular way.
So they are kind of similar.
I can see overlap. I can see overlap for sure. I think the overlap is that the sufficient assumption can sometimes, such as in this case, function like a general principle.
Okay, that's what I just want to make sure.
Okay, yeah.
Sometimes with the sufficient assumption questions, if your goal is to knock over a Jenga tower, you can push it with your hands. You could also throw a bowling ball at it, or you could also bring in a giant crane and swing one of those giant things. And if it's a sufficient assumption, any one of those things will do, because you're just trying to knock over the Jenga box. So it could be super broad, but if it's super broad and your thing fits within that broad thing, then it totally works.
It just has to achieve the goal.
It just has to achieve.
Exactly, that's a perfect analogy. I like to think of it like you could kill a mosquito with a fly swatter or with a nuclear warhead. They'll both get the job done. One of them is definitely overkill, but that's okay. Could be as strong as you want. Like you want to buy a $1 item, a $20 bill will do it, a $100 bill will do it, $1 million will do it also. But none of those things are necessarily necessary. Now, this is reminding me of different categories of sufficient assumption questions. I could walk through a couple of those. So we have one where the argument is simply saying A requires B. A sufficient assumption could be simply A requires B. A requires B, if learned as new information, is sufficient to require the exact same thing. If you learn this as new information, it is guaranteed to require that. Seems obvious, but with LSAC's wording, of course, it can be tougher to spot sometimes. But this actually happens. This is like a restatement or a broadening of the argument itself. If the restatement is true, then the original will be true also. This happens. It happens quite a bit, actually. You could also have an argument with, again, saying A requires B, and the sufficient assumption being the contrapositive of that, or a broadened version of the contrapositive as well. Totally fine. It happens all the time. The third category is what I was going over earlier, which is a little more complex. You have an argument with both evidence and conclusion and conditionals within each. So when the sufficient conditions are the same, we link the necessaries, and I like to think about it as the necessaries are being linked going clockwise from E to F. So the parts that are the same remain the same. The parts that are different, you link going clockwise, imagined as a circle. E requires F. Because if you learn as new information that if you learn as given, D requires E, plus sufficient assumption, E requires F, you get a longer chain, D to E to F, and D to F in the conclusion here is guaranteed. So this was your sufficient assumption, and this was your evidence. Together, they guarantee the conclusion. This is one of the most common formulas. Like I said, it comes up less often than it used to, but as we did see, there is one example where it came up, so it can happen. Now, there's another version of this one that's basically just the contrapositive of the entire thing. So you could have evidence, conclusion. Evidence is A requires B. Conclusion is C requires B. So the necessary conditions here are the same this time. And so these are the same, but again, we link the parts that are different going clockwise. So our sufficient assumption will be C to A. And we see that C to A combined with A to B leads to C to B, guaranteeing our conclusion right here. So this part was our sufficient assumption, and this part was our evidence, and together they give you your conclusion. So these are the most common formats. There are a couple more that come up occasionally, but these are the biggest ones. And then there are, I think, a lot of them that are harder, just even simply category 1, like what we just did now, where it's broader, but the structure is overall the same. It's a general principle that guarantees the particular situation in the stimulus, in this case about love referring to feelings. And I have an article on my site where I walk through these in more detail with lists of examples in each category.